The object had been there longer than the star it orbited. That was the first thing the survey logs made clear, and it was the kind of fact that should have been impossible. Stars are ancient things. They burn for billions of years before they die, and this one, a young, unstable yellow dwarf still flickering with the uneven brightness of something that had not yet settled into a rhythm, had been burning for approximately 400 million years. That was not a short time. That was longer than complex life had existed on most worlds. And yet the object drifting just beyond its outer gravity was older. The surface erosion patterns told a story no one had expected to read. Radiation scarring from at least 3 different stellar types, none of which were present in this system, none of which had burned in this region of space for geological ages. The object had not formed here. It had not drifted here recently. It had been placed here, deliberately, at a time when the universe itself had looked different than it did now. It did not belong here. It did not belong anywhere that any living civilization could point to on a map. The exploration vessel Halcyon Drift found it entirely by accident. A routine mapping pass through an unnamed system so far from established trade routes that the consortium had not even bothered to assign it a catalog number. No expectations. No anomalies flagged in advance. Just empty space, thin dust fields, and a star not important enough to have earned a name. The crew was tired. The mission had been running for 11 months, and the kind of excitement that carries people through deep space surveys had long since worn down into something quieter, something that looked a lot like routine, until the object appeared on long-range sensors. The sensor officer, a young woman named Tevel who had never in 3 years of survey work flagged anything that turned out to be more than debris, felt something shift in her chest when the reading first resolved. Not excitement. Something older than excitement. Something closer to the feeling of stepping into a room and knowing, before you can see it, that something in the room has changed. She stared at the readout for 11 seconds before she said anything. 11 seconds of her heart beating faster than it had in months, of her fingers hovering over the console, of that ancient animal part of her brain whispering that this was different. "Captain," she said, "you need to see this." At first, they thought it was debris, a fragment of a broken station, maybe, or the remains of an old navigation buoy that had drifted off course over centuries. Debris was the rational explanation. Debris was the thing surveys found when they found anything at all. But debris did not hold position the way this object held position. It maintained a perfectly stable orientation relative to nothing measurable, no gravity well, no magnetic anchor, no detectable mechanism of any kind keeping it exactly where it was. And debris did not broadcast. The signal was so low in power that it had almost blended into background radiation. If the Halcyon Drift had been moving at standard survey velocity, it would have missed it entirely. If Tevel had been 30 seconds slower in her recognition of the anomaly, they would have passed beyond sensor range and continued on their route and never known. But she had not been slower, and they had not passed. And the signal was there, cycling at an interval of precisely 47 seconds, too exact to be natural phenomenon and too slow to serve any function a distress beacon would need. It was not asking for help. It was not warning of danger. It was simply there, pulsing outward into the dark with the patient, indifferent rhythm of something that had been doing this for a very long time and intended to continue doing it regardless of whether anyone was listening. The captain ordered a closer pass. No one argued. In 11 months of survey work, no one had argued for caution when curiosity was on the table. Curiosity, at that distance from any established route, was stronger than every other instinct. The Halcyon Drift adjusted its trajectory in a slow arc, closing the gap over 2 hours. The crew gathered at every available screen. Even the engineers, who had not been required on the bridge in 3 weeks, found reasons to drift upward and stand in doorways. The air on the ship changed. Something moved through it that was not quite hope and not quite fear, but shared the temperature of both. As they approached, the object resolved into something that forced the bridge crew into a silence they did not immediately understand. It was a structure, not large, not impressive in scale. A single, solid form, roughly rectangular, its edges worn by exposure to forces none of them could fully identify, but still sharp enough in their geometry to announce, unmistakably, that something had made this. Something with intention and knowledge and the means to execute both. No visible seams. No ports or hatches. No engine configuration. No markings that matched any manufacturing standard recorded in 60 years of consortium exploration. Just a dark surface that seemed to absorb more light than physics said it should, as though the object were pulling something from the space around it that it had no obligation to return. And then the translation systems found the writing. That was the second thing that did not make sense. The surface of the object was covered in text. Not one language, not a single declaration in a single script. Dozens of languages, possibly more, layered across its face in careful, evenly spaced lines, each block of script distinct from the others, separated with a precision that suggested the designer had understood exactly what they were doing and had done it with the kind of patience that measured itself in centuries. Some of the scripts were familiar, at least partially. Old trade dialects still used in French systems. Imperial codes from administrations that had collapsed 300 years before the consortium existed. Fragments of languages that had fallen out of common use, but were still archived somewhere in the translation databases. Others were not familiar at all. Others triggered partial matches, incomplete reconstructions, linguistic roots without living speakers. Dead languages. The kind that existed only in historical records, and the broken inscriptions recovered from the ruins of worlds that no longer had anyone alive who remembered what they had once been called. The translation system struggled, not because the message was complex. The message was simple in a way that made the struggle stranger. It was as though the system could not process how anything this old could be this coherent. The first clear translation appeared on the main display 37 seconds after the initial scan. Then another. Then another. Different languages. Same meaning. Exactly the same meaning, carrying no variation, no nuance, no cultural adjustment for the assumptions or diplomatic frameworks of different civilizations. Just a direct, literal equivalence, carried unchanged across every version of the text, as though the designer had understood that some meanings should not be softened. The communications officer read it out loud without being asked. His voice was steady. He was proud of that later. You are entering restricted space. A pause that lasted longer than it needed to. You were not invited. The final line took longer to render. The dead languages required deep reconstruction, pattern modeling filling in gaps where entire grammatical structures no longer existed anywhere in any database. When it resolved, it changed nothing about the meaning. It only confirmed it. Turn around. That was all. No identification of who had placed the object there. No claim of ownership over the surrounding space in any legal framework any civilization would recognize. No threat. No explanation. No indication of what would happen if the instruction was ignored, because the instruction had been written by something that apparently did not feel the need to explain consequences. Just 3 sentences, repeated across languages that span civilizations still active, civilizations long dead, and civilizations that the Halcyon Drifts database could only classify as unresolved origin, which was the system's polite way of admitting it had no idea they had ever existed at all. The captain leaned forward slightly in her chair. Her name was Oren Vasht, and she had been doing this for 22 years, and she had the kind of face that had learned not to show things it was still working out. But Tevel, watching her from across the bridge, saw it anyway. Saw the moment the captain understood something. Saw the moment understanding settled into something heavier than curiosity. Scan for power sources, Vasht said. None detected. Active systems? Only the signal. Minimal output. No defensive grid. No propulsion. No indication this thing should still be functioning. It should have been dead. By every measurable standard, it should have failed long ago. Materials degrade. Power sources exhaust themselves. Signals fade into the background noise of the universe over timescales measured in thousands of years, not millions. This signal had not faded. This structure had not degraded in any way consistent with its apparent age. It held its position in the dark, its weak broadcast continuing at the same 47-second interval, as if time were a condition that applied to other things but not to this. Vash studied the text on the screen for a long time. 3 sentences. No threat. No consequence listed. No mechanism described. She had encountered warnings before. Every spacefaring species eventually developed them. Border markers. Defense perimeters. Automated challenge beacons. They all followed the same logic, the same emotional grammar. Here is our claim. Here is what it means. Here is what will happen to you if you cross it. They justified themselves. They explained themselves. They assumed you needed convincing. This one did not. It assumed you already understood. That was what made the room feel smaller than it had a moment before. That was the thing Vashti could not set aside. Not the age of the object. Not the number of languages. The assumption. The quiet, absolute, architectural assumption that the cost of ignoring these 3 sentences was so obvious that listing it would have been an insult to whoever was reading them. She took a breath. We log it as a warning, she said. And then, quietly, because she understood the weight of what she was about to say and she wanted the ship's recorder to capture it without drama, she said, and we turn around. No one argued. The halcyon drift adjusted course. The object remained where it had always been, its signal continuing to pulse outward into empty space, patient and unchanged, waiting for the next ship that would eventually find it and face the same decision. It did not need to do anything else. It already had. The report did not reach the directorate immediately. Survey data moved slowly through the consortium's networks, filtered and categorized and assigned priority scores based on trade relevance, resource potential, and strategic value. An unnamed system with no confirmed habitable worlds and no registered claims did not score highly. It sat in the processing queue for 72 hours before a human being looked at it. What was unusual was the annotation attached to the file when it finally arrived on Arbiter Thessane's desk. It had not been flagged by an automated system. 3 separate review officers had each elevated it manually, each one adding a note in different words that all said the same thing. Unclassified anomaly. Persistent signal. Non-expiring warning structure. 3 different people, looking at the same data from the same survey, each independently concluding that this was something the normal categories could not hold. Thessane had been in the middle of a territorial arbitration case when it arrived. 2 minor colonies arguing over mining rights to an asteroid belt that barely justified the administrative cost of the dispute. He closed the file without finishing it. He did not think about the asteroid belt again for 6 weeks. He read the translation once. Then again, slower, the way he read things when he suspected the first reading had missed something. Then a 3rd time, cross-referencing the linguistic overlays and reconstruction confidence scores on the dead languages. The system reported 92% accuracy on the oldest recovered scripts. That number stopped him. 92% accuracy required baseline data. Baseline data on dead languages came from recovered inscriptions, from fragments, from incomplete records assembled over generations of archaeological work. For the system to achieve 92% reconstruction on scripts that had no living speakers and minimal surviving records meant one of 2 things. Either the translation system was being overconfident, filling gaps with probability and reporting it as certainty, or the message had been written in a way that minimized linguistic drift, that had been structured with enough internal redundancy across enough different scripts that even severely degraded versions of those languages preserved enough signal to reconstruct the meaning. That was not a message that had been composed quickly. That was a message that had been engineered. Thessane leaned back and felt something settle into place in his mind. Not a conclusion yet. The shape of one. He had spent most of his career studying first contact failures. Not the successful negotiations that made it into the official histories, but the mistakes, the misread signals, the cultural assumptions that had seemed obvious to one side and been invisible to the other, the small errors in interpretation that had scaled, over months and years, into conflicts that cost millions of lives and left behind grievances that still festered in the consortium's outer systems 2 generations later. He knew what warnings looked like. He knew how they worked. He knew the grammar of deterrence and the logic of borders and the way civilizations signaled their limits to one another when they had enough confidence to signal anything at all. This did not fit that grammar. Warnings explained themselves. They justified their existence. They defined consequences. They tried to control behavior through a calculus of cost and benefit, and the calculus only worked if both sides could see it. This did neither. This assumed compliance the way the laws of physics assumed compliance. Not through threat. Through the apparent expectation that the reader already understood why the sentence was true. He requested historical cross-referencing. The system returned partial matches within seconds. Fragments. Mentions of boundary markers in old exploration logs from the early expansion centuries. references to zones where navigation beacons transmitted simple exclusion directives, and survey teams had noted the transmissions and moved on without investigating. Reports that had been dismissed at the time because they did not align with any known territorial authority, and the early consortium had been in no mood to find reasons to stop expanding. Different sectors, different centuries, the same pattern, 3 sentences, always the same 3 sentences. He counted the instances the system could verify. 14 separate records across a span of 230 years. 14 encounters with objects that all said the same thing in the same structure across the same layered languages. And 14 ships that had turned around. Until now. He opened a new file. He wrote the words carefully, weighing each one before he committed it to the record. Classification request. Preliminary threat assessment. Subject: unidentified territorial marker network. Potential indicator of a controlled spatial boundary established and maintained by an unknown actor with an extended temporal strategy. He attached everything. The Halcyon Drift Report. The historical fragments. The linguistic analysis. The reconstruction confidence scores. The cross-referencing. Everything he had. Then he added the final line. Recommendation: do not cross the boundary under any circumstances pending full investigation with no timeline constraint. He sent it up the chain. The response came back 12 hours later. Acknowledged. Forwarded to Expansion Directorate for review. He had expected that. What he had not expected was how completely his recommendation would be set aside in the meeting that followed. The Directorate session was scheduled for the next cycle. Thessain attended remotely, his image projected into the chamber alongside the other advisory figures who had been invited to contribute context. He was not a voting member. His role was to analyze and advise. Whether the analysis shaped anything was someone else's decision. Sector Director Havek chaired the session. Older than most in the room. Experienced enough to have seen conflict, but far enough removed from it now that conflict had become something abstract. A historical problem. A thing that had been solved by the existence of the consortium itself. The system in question, Havek began, has been assessed as resource positive. Preliminary mineral density scans indicate yields above regional average. No active claims registered with the consortium charter. No known defensive installations. He paused. A signal has been detected. Arbiter Thessain has submitted a preliminary analysis. Several heads turned in Thessain's direction. Polite attention. Not genuine interest. The kind of attention you give someone you have already decided not to fully hear. Arbiter Havek said, summarize your concern. Thessain had learned, over a long career, that summaries removed the parts that mattered. So instead of summarizing, he said, the signal is not a territorial claim. It is a boundary. The distinction is critical. A few members exchanged glances. On what basis? Havek asked. The structure carries no identification markers. No legal framework any consortium instrument would recognize. No assertion of ownership in terms we can engage with diplomatically. It does not claim the space. It assumes the space. The message does not say this is ours. It says you were not invited. The psychological weight of those two things is entirely different. One of the directors spoke. If it does not assert ownership, it cannot be enforced through any mechanism we recognize. That, Thessain said carefully, would be true if enforcement required assertion. I am suggesting that we are dealing with something that does not require assertion because it has already demonstrated its authority through the mere fact of the object's existence and persistence. Another director. The message contains no threat. Yes. Then it cannot function as a deterrent. Thessain paused. He chose the next words with the precision of a man who understood that these words were going into the record and that someone might read them later and wish they had been listened to more carefully. It is not a deterrent in the way we build deterrents. Every deterrent system in the consortium's history, and in the history of every civilization we have ever encountered, defines a cost. It makes the calculation explicit. It says cross this line and face this consequence. That is how deterrence works. It works because both parties can run the numbers. He looked at the translation on the display. That message does not define a cost. It does not say what will happen, which means one of 3 things. Either there is no consequence, in which case this is nothing, or whoever built it lacked the capability to describe a consequence, in which case they are gone, and this is archaeology. Or the consequence is so well understood, so inevitable, so obvious to every civilization that has reached the point of reading this message, that defining it would be the kind of insult only an amateur commits. The silence that followed was thin and uncomfortable. Havok tapped the table once. You are constructing an argument on absence. Yes. That is not a foundation for policy. No, Thessain agreed. It is a foundation for caution. And caution costs nothing except the resource yield from one system that we do not need and cannot safely claim. The vote was not close. The Directorate authorized a military survey expedition. 40 ships designated for the initial assessment wave, with authorization for up to 200 additional vessels pending the results of the first engagement. The operation was given a name that told you everything about how the Directorate had already decided to interpret the situation. Frontier clarification. As though what existed out there was not a mystery, but a bureaucratic misunderstanding that needed a firm administrative correction. Thessain ended the connection before the session concluded. He sat in his office for a long time. Then he opened the report file one last time and added a single line at the bottom, beneath everything else, in the plain language that he knew no one in a position of authority was going to read. Do not cross the boundary. Then he closed the file and sat in the quiet, and tried not to think about the 14 survey ships across 230 years of history that had all, without exception, turned around. Fleet Singer Dravith Ulcane had not requested the command of frontier clarification. He had not needed to. His record spoke for him, and in the consortium's expansion command structure, records like his generated their own gravity. 2 prior expansion operations, both completed within projected timelines, both executed without significant losses, both noted in internal assessments as exemplary in their efficiency and restraint. He was not reckless. He was not the kind of commander who substituted aggression for thinking. He was precise. He was thorough. He had never encountered an opponent who did not eventually behave according to expectation, and he had built his entire career on the understanding that expectation, properly calibrated, was the most powerful tool a military commander possessed. He stood on the command platform of his flagship, the Voice of Resolution, a heavy command carrier with a crew of 4,400, as the final ships of his fleet moved into formation around him. 40 vessels in total for the initial wave. The hulls aligned in clean geometric spacing, each vessel occupying its assigned position with the quiet discipline of a force that had rehearsed this exact kind of operation enough times that rehearsal had become reflex. He had read Thessain's report. He had read it carefully, because Thessain had a reputation and the report had been flagged at 3 separate review levels, which meant that whatever the Directorate had decided, the report had at least given people pause. He had read the linguistic analysis and the historical cross-referencing and the 14 prior encounter records and the final recommendation. He had considered it with the same professional seriousness he gave everything. And then he had filed it. Not dismissed. Not ignored. Filed. It did not align with operational reality. The system showed no defensive installations, no fleet presence, no energy signatures consistent with active military capacity. Thessain's argument was built on the absence of evidence and the philosophical weight of old language. In Ulcane's experience, absence of evidence was not evidence of anything except the absence of evidence. Whatever was out there, he had 40 ships. And whatever had built that marker, it had been built long enough ago that any civilization capable of enforcing it had probably not existed for a very long time. The fleet moved as one. A smooth, controlled transition from stillness to motion, the ships accelerating in coordinated vectors before aligning into long-range formation. The stars stretched across the viewport. The consortium's named systems fell behind them. Open space received them with the indifferent space always showed toward the things that moved through it. Transit took 9 days. 9 days of crew rotations and maintenance cycles and briefings and the particular kind of waiting that military operations required, which was not passive waiting, but the continuous low-level engagement of a force that needed to remain ready without expending the readiness it was saving for what came next. Ulcane spent the transit reviewing resource data, tactical overlays, extraction logistics, the practical machinery of a mission that, on paper, was already half complete. The star resolved first on the forward display as they approached the unnamed system, then the outer debris fields. Then, at the edge of the system's gravitational influence, exactly where the survey logs had placed it, The object. It appeared exactly as described. A dark shape against the starfield, holding position with no visible mechanism. No change. No response to their approach. The signal reached them when they were still 2 hours out. The same 47-second pulse, low power, steady, carrying its message outward into the dark the way it always had. Display translation, Ulcane said. The 3 lines appeared on the main screen. You are entering restricted space. You are not invited. Turn around. Ulcane studied it for a moment. He felt something. He would admit that later in his report, though he would not use the word that actually fit. He felt the weight of the phrase. He felt the way it looked at him. But he set it aside. He had a mission. He had a fleet. He had a directorate authorization and a resource assessment and a crew of 4,400 people who had trusted him with their lives because his record said he was worth trusting. Maintain course, he said. Open a channel first. Standard hailing. Protocol required it. He fulfilled the protocol. A broad-spectrum transmission, cycling through every known frequency, carrying a clear identification packet. This is Fleet Singer Ulcane of the Consortium Expansion Fleet. We are conducting an authorized territorial assessment of this system. If this space is under active claim, respond with identification and terms of engagement. The message repeated. Once, twice, 3 times. The channel returned silence. No shift in the signal. No new transmission. No indication that anything had received them or, if it had received them, had found their words worth responding to. Close the channel. The fleet crossed the boundary. They passed the object one by one. 40 hulls moving through the space around the ancient marker with the unhurried confidence of a force that outweighed it, outmatched it, and outnumbered everything it appeared to represent. For a moment, as the flagship cleared the marker's position, it sat briefly visible through the rear viewport. Dark. Still. Unchanged. Its signal continued for a few seconds. The transmission lagged briefly, making it feel as though the object were calling after them. Then even that faded. Ahead, the system opened. The forward sensors mapped it in clean overlays. 7 primary bodies. 2 asteroid belts with mineral density projections well above regional average. No visible infrastructure. No ships. No signs of habitation or any kind of active presence. Empty, exactly as the preliminary scans had promised. The unknown had resolved into the expected. What no one noticed, because no sensor in the fleet had been oriented toward it when it happened, was the change in the object behind them. Not a change in structure. Not a change in position. A change in the signal. The 47-second pulse that had maintained exactly the same output for longer than any system could reliably measure shifted, just slightly, just enough. It did not grow louder. It did not grow faster. It simply carried farther, deeper, not directed toward anything, broadcast outward in every direction, the way you might light a signal fire not because you expected to be seen immediately, but because you understood that someone, somewhere, would eventually see it. A change so small it registered on nothing, so subtle it triggered no alert in any system on any ship in the fleet. But it was the first change the object had made in a very long time, and it happened in the exact second the fleet crossed the line. The first 6 hours inside the system passed without incident. This was the part that felt like confirmation. This was the part that validated the pre-mission assessment and made Thessane's warning feel like what the Directorate had quietly suspected it was all along. The overreaction of an analyst who had spent too much time studying old disasters and not enough time in operational reality. The fleet spread into survey formation, ships adjusting spacing to optimize sensor coverage, data populating the tactical overlays in clean, readable gradients. Mineral density, gravitational mapping, radiation levels, all consistent with an unclaimed system that had simply been sitting here, unnoticed, waiting for the right kind of attention. Nothing moved. Nothing reacted. The silence was total, and the silence felt like permission. At hour 8, Ulcane ordered a deep scan. Not because anything had prompted it. Because something about the quality of the silence had begun to bother him in a way he could not fully articulate. He had operated in quiet systems before. He had mapped dead systems and cold systems and systems where nothing had ever lived and nothing had ever tried to. This felt different from those. Not in any way he could point to in the data. The data was clean. The data was consistent. The data was, in fact, so perfectly consistent with every pre-mission projection that the consistency itself had become a texture in his perception of the situation, something his experience was registering as unusual, even though his instruments reported nothing unusual at all. "Run a deep scan," he said. The sensor officer pulled more power to the arrays, extending range, increasing resolution. The system fed back information in layers. First pass, no change. Second pass, no change. Third pass. The sensor officer frowned, just slightly, just enough for the officer standing beside him to notice. "Sir," he said, "readings are consistent." "With what?" "With everything. Gravitational patterns match projections exactly. Thermal signatures match background expectations exactly. Distribution of particulate matter in both asteroid belts is within 0.3% of predicted variance. Everything is exactly where the models said it would be." Ulkane looked at him. "That is not unusual." "No, sir." A pause. "It should just be unusual for it to be this exact." The words settled into the space between them. At hour 14, the first contact appeared. It did not arrive with a drive signature. It did not emerge from a jump transition with the energy spike that every known propulsion system produced when moving into real space. There was no approach vector, no deceleration curve, no sensor precursor of any kind. It was simply there, the way a fact is there when you finally understand it had been true the whole time you were not understanding it. "Contact," the sensor officer said. His voice was very controlled. "Single mass signature. Bearing 041. Range static." "Static?" "It's not moving, sir. It's just there." Ulkane crossed to the primary display. The image resolved. A ship, smaller than anything in his fleet by a significant margin. Compact, unremarkable in profile, its design language suggesting nothing about its purpose or its origin. It sat in open space between the fleet and the inner system, positioned with the kind of precision that was not coincidence. It had not drifted into that position. It had been placed there. The positioning itself was a sentence. "Energy output?" Ulkane asked. "Minimal. Idle equivalent." "Weapons?" "Cold. Active targeting?" "Negative." He opened a channel. He gave his identification. He asked for theirs. The ship did not respond. It did not move. It behaved less like an opponent and more like a reference point. Like something left where it was specifically so you would look at it and understand something about where you were and what that meant. Ulkane was still processing that when the sensor officer's voice came again, tighter than before. "Additional contacts. Multiple bearings." Ulkane turned. "Where?" "They are resolving, sir. Not approaching. Not accelerating from elsewhere. They are resolving. As though they were there already, and we are only now able to see them." The tactical display expanded. Points of light appeared. Not quickly. Steadily. The way stars appear as your eyes adjust to darkness. Not arriving from somewhere else, but becoming visible because the conditions have changed. 3, then 12, then 30, then more. 57 additional contacts, their signatures sharpening from near invisible to fully resolved as the fleet's sensors recalibrated to recognize what they were seeing. Ships, all of them, positioned across the system not in any formation designed for attack or retreat. Positioned in a pattern designed around the space the consortium fleet occupied, not surrounding it from the outside, occupying the spaces it would need. "They are running cold," the operations officer said. "No active emissions. No targeting systems online. No movement. None." Ulkane looked at the display for a long time. The fleet. The single ship ahead. And now, above and below, and flanking and behind, 57 more. Not threatening. Present. The way walls are present. The way gravity is present. Something that does not need to announce itself because it is already the condition of the space you are in. "Range to boundary marker?" he asked. Navigation answered without hesitation. "Beyond immediate return vector. We would need full fleet reorientation to generate a return course." "Do it." A pause. "Sir." "Reorientation paths." A breath. "They are occupied." Ulkane's eyes moved to the escape vectors on the tactical overlay. Every line extending away from the fleet's current position intersected with one of the newly resolved contacts. Not because those ships had moved into those positions, because they had already been there. Before the fleet arrived. Before the first survey pass. Before the system had been classified as empty and undefended. They had been here the whole time. Running cold. invisible to sensors that had not known to look for them because nothing in the pre-mission data had suggested there was anything to look for. Ulkane understood. This was not a developing situation. This was a prepared one. They had not entered an empty system. They had entered a system that had already accounted for them. A system that had known they were coming, not because of any intelligence failure, not because of any leak in the consortium's planning process, but because whatever was behind the marker had been waiting for exactly this kind of arrival for a very long time, and had prepared for it with the calm thoroughness of something that had never expected the arrival to be different from what it was. The single ship ahead began to move. Not quickly, not aggressively. It advanced at a steady, deliberate pace, closing the distance with a trajectory so precise it felt like intention rather than navigation. A line. Direct. Without doubt. Channel open, the communications officer said. This time, the response came. The display shifted. A human face appeared. Still. Composed. Eyes that held his with a steadiness he recognized from his own career. The eyes of someone who had been here long enough, had prepared long enough, had committed to something thoroughly enough that the moment they had been preparing for held no uncertainty for them. Fleet Singer, she said. The translation was clean and immediate. You crossed the boundary. Ulkane held her gaze. Yes. You were given a warning. The system is unclaimed, he said. Under consortium charter, the boundary marker does not constitute a recognized territorial assertion without registered authority. She looked at him the way someone looks at a person who has just explained at length why they believe the weather should not apply to them. The system, she said, is irrelevant. The boundary is not. Ulkane felt the structure of the conversation shift the way the situation itself had shifted minutes before. You have not identified your authority. I don't need to. 3 words. No force behind them. No aggression. No attempt to intimidate. Just a statement of condition. The way you might say the sun rises because it rises, and the discussion of why that is true is separate from the fact that it is. You are outnumbered, Ulkane said. 58 contacts against 40 consortium vessels, several of which are heavy class. The arithmetic does not favor your position. The woman's expression did not change. You counted what we let you see, she said. The first new contacts appeared on the tactical display before she had finished the sentence. Not 58. Not the total he had been working with for the last hour. New signatures, dozens of them, emerging from positions in the asteroid belts, from the shadow of the system's outer gas body, from coordinates so close to the fleet's own formation that they could not have been missed by any functional sensor array unless they had been actively designed to be missed. The number climbed. 80, 100, 120. It stopped climbing not because there were no more contacts to find, but because Ulkane's sensor officer had stopped reporting and was simply staring at his display. 123 ships. Against 40. But the number was not the point. The numbers had never been the point. How long? Ulkane asked. It was not a question he planned to ask. It came out because it was the one that mattered, and he had always been the kind of commander who asked the question that mattered even when the answer was going to be uncomfortable. She held his gaze. Long enough. A pause, measured and deliberate. We were here before you decided to come. The silence that settled after those words was not the silence of empty space. It was the silence of understanding arriving in a room where it had not previously been welcome. She spoke again. You can leave. You are blocking our exit vectors, he said. Yes. Then you are not offering us a choice. You are describing a corridor. The corners of her eyes changed slightly. Not a smile. Recognition. The corridor, she said, leads out. The other direction leads nowhere you should go. Ulkane looked at the display. He looked at the route out, the one path that remained unoccupied, the one vector that led back toward the boundary and back toward the consortium systems beyond it. And he looked at the alternative. The deeper system. More resources. More data. The mission objectives still technically achievable if he pushed forward. He understood then with perfect clarity what was happening. They had been guided in, and they were being given one opportunity to be guided out. And the choice was real, but only one of its options led anywhere that his 4,400 crew members would survive to remember. He opened a fleet-wide channel. All ships. This is Fleet Singer Ulkane. Initiate full reorientation toward exit vector. No deviation. No engagement. We are withdrawing. And then, because he knew what was coming if they did not do this fast enough, he said, maximum acceleration. Now, the fleet turned. They did not make it. The first strike came before the reorientation was 40% complete. It did not come from the ships that were visible. It came from the positions none of Ulcane's tactical systems had flagged because those positions existed between the known contacts, in the dead space between identifiable signatures that his AI had classified as clear. The strike hit a frigate on the formation's outer edge, a single, precise impact at a junction point in its shield matrix that his engineering team later calculated had a surface area of less than 2 square meters. Not a lucky shot, an informed one. And then all of it began at once. What happened in the next 4 hours was not a battle in any sense Ulcane had trained for. A battle had patterns. A battle had phases. A battle had a logic you could trace, a decision tree you could map, a set of moves and counter-moves that your training and your AI and your crew's experience could analyze and respond to. What happened in that unnamed system had none of those qualities. The human ships did not fight as a fleet. They fought as something that had no name in the consortium's military vocabulary. Each vessel moved independently, but independently in a way that was nothing like chaos. They moved as though each captain had perfect awareness not just of the immediate tactical picture, but of the picture as it would exist 3 minutes and 10 minutes and an hour from now, and had already chosen the action that would be most useful at that point. They did not coordinate through signals his communications arrays could detect. They coordinated through understanding, through a shared model of the situation that was so complete and so current that it needed no transmission because every ship in the formation already held it. His tactical AI failed to produce reliable behavioral predictions within the first 40 minutes. Failed is perhaps too dramatic a word. It produced predictions. They were simply no longer reliable. Every time it identified a pattern in the human ship movements and generated a forecast, the forecast was invalidated within minutes. Not because the human ships had changed their approach, but because they had never been following the pattern the AI had identified. The AI had found a shape in the data. The shape had been coincidental. There was no underlying pattern to find because the human fleet was not executing a pattern. It was executing a moment-by-moment response to conditions that it understood better than anything in Ulcane's command structure did. He lost his first ship 22 minutes in. A destroyer, positioned slightly forward of its assigned vector, hit by a coordinated strike from 3 human ships approaching from angles his defensive systems had not allocated resources to cover because those angles had been classified as low probability based on the known contact positions. The classification had been correct. The contacts that fired had not been known. They had been in the dead space. And when they moved through the gaps in his formation with a precision that should have required a level of sensor data about his fleet that he could not explain how they had obtained. He tried to adapt. He gave orders to reclassify threat assessments. He told his captains to stop relying on predictive modeling and respond only to immediate conditions. He changed formations 3 times in the first hour. Each time, the human ships adjusted around the new formation before it was fully established, occupying the positions they would need before he had even finished ordering the positions he was creating the gaps to fill. At the 2-hour mark, a consortium cruiser identified what appeared to be a weakening in the human positions, a cluster of contacts that had been taking damage and whose maneuverability ratings had dropped. Standard doctrine. Exploit the weak point. Concentrate force. Maintain pressure. The cruiser wing committed. The weakness had been real. Every piece of data supporting the assessment had been genuine. The human ships in that cluster were damaged. Their rated maneuverability was genuinely reduced. And it meant absolutely nothing. A human vessel with its primary drive gone and its forward hull compromised rotated on its lateral thrusters, a maneuver that used 15% of the energy a normal combat movement would have required, and brought its remaining weapon arrays into alignment with the leading consortium cruiser's approach vector. His cruiser's captain responded correctly. Evasive action. Shield redistribution to the exposed face. Counterfire. Every decision right. Every decision exactly what the training said. The human ship absorbed the counterfire with its damaged hull, did not retreat, did not attempt to evade anything, and returned fire twice at the point in the defensive cycle where the shield redistribution left the cruiser's aft power conduits briefly exposed. Not a vulnerability that would appear in any standard tactical database. A vulnerability that only existed because of the specific way this specific cruiser had redistributed its shields in response to this specific attack in this specific situation. The cruiser was gone in 8 seconds. Ulkane watched it happen from the command platform of his flagship and understood something that he could not yet put into language, but that was assembling itself in the back of his mind with the terrible patience of a truth that knows it has all the time it needs. They were not fighting a military force. They were fighting a civilization's accumulated understanding of conflict, distilled into action. Every ship in that formation had been doing this for longer than the consortium's expansion program had existed. Every captain had been trained by people who had been trained by people who had known this moment was coming and had spent generations preparing for it. And the preparation was not in the ships, or the weapons, or the numbers. The preparation was in the understanding. In the perfect, terrible clarity of a force that knew exactly what it was doing and exactly why, and had never once needed to ask whether it was justified, because it had known the answer to that question before the question existed. At the 3-hour mark, the human fleet began to close around the consortium formation with the slow, inevitable geometry of a tide coming in. Not rushing. Not needing to rush. The pressure was constant and it came from every direction simultaneously, and every time a consortium ship tried to create a gap, the gap was already filled before the movement was complete. Ships went down. Not quickly. Not cleanly. The human ships were precise, not wasteful. They struck what they needed to strike and stopped when they had achieved what they needed to achieve, and the result was a consortium fleet that was losing cohesion not all at once but ship by ship, captain by captain, as the tactical picture that had started this engagement became something no officer in any of those vessels could any longer pretend to understand. At the 4-hour mark, Ulkane's flagship took a hit that killed the lights on the command deck for 6 seconds. When they came back, the tactical display was showing 31 consortium vessels still in formation. 9 minutes later, it showed 24. Fleet Singer. His second officer's voice, very steady, very quiet. We need to make a decision. I know. The formation is gone. We cannot recover it. If we continue. I know. He opened a fleet-wide channel. His voice was steady. He was proud of that later. He was proud that it was steady. All remaining vessels. This is Fleet Singer Ulkane. Disengage immediately. Minimum defensive profile. Escape pods ready. Evacuate non-essential personnel to pods now. If your ship cannot maintain drive power for controlled withdrawal, evacuate your crew and trigger emergency beacon. Do not continue to engage. Do not attempt offensive action. Get your people out. He paused. That is an order. The next 40 minutes were not something Ulkane could describe in tactical terms. They were something else. Something that did not have a name in military doctrine because military doctrine was built on the assumption that the people writing it would be able to learn from each encounter and incorporate what they had learned into the next one. There was no next one here. There was only what was happening, ship by ship, crew by crew, for 1,400 people scattered across a system that had never been meant for them, and that had now, with absolute and unhurried clarity, made that truth undeniable. The human ships stopped when the consortium vessels stopped. Ulkane noticed this and recorded it, because it was the most important thing that happened in those 40 minutes. When a consortium ship went cold, the human ship nearest to it did not press the advantage. It ceased engagement. It moved to cover. It waited. It had no interest in destruction beyond what was necessary to end the fight. And the fight ended, for each individual vessel, the moment each individual vessel stopped fighting. He found himself in an escape pod he did not fully remember reaching. The corridor. His second officer's hand on his arm. The launch. The separation. Then the pod drifting in a debris field that had been a fleet 6 hours ago. He oriented the viewport. Through the debris, he could see the human ships moving. Not quickly, not with aggression. Moving through the field with the calm, methodical purpose of a force that had completed one task and moved to the next. They were recovering pods. Matching velocity with each one they found. Securing it. Moving to the next. No urgency. No theater. Just the work that remained. Of his original 40 ships, 11 maintained enough structural integrity to be classified as vessels. The other 29 were debris, escape pods, and the silence of space where 4,400 crew members had been scattered into the dark. His post-engagement count, assembled over the following hours from pod transponder data and survivor reports, showed 2,116 survivors from the first wave, 1,212 confirmed casualties, 972 unaccounted for, a number that would not fully resolve for weeks and would never fully resolve to zero. He activated his pod's transmitter. "This is Fleet Singer Ulcane. Status, alive. Requesting recovery." The response came within 90 seconds. Signal received. "We are collecting survivors." The voice was the same one from the screen. Unchanged. "How many?" he asked. "Still counting. Additional pods still being located." "And yours?" A pause. "Significant losses. Nothing more. No elaboration. No comparison that might have been used to establish a hierarchy of suffering. Just the fact." She said it the way people say things they have made peace with because they understood, before the engagement began, that the cost was real and they were willing to pay it. Ulcane looked out at the debris field. "This didn't have to happen," he said. It was not an accusation and it was not a defense. It was simply the truest thing he could say. "You were given a warning," she said. "Yes." Silence. Then, quietly, more to himself than to the transmission, "You meant it." "Yes." No pride in that word. No satisfaction. Just the same absolute factual quality that the 3 sentences on the marker had carried. The warning had been true because it was always going to be true. The outcome had been inevitable not because she had made it inevitable, but because it had always been the shape of what would happen if the boundary was crossed. She had not created the consequence. She had only been the consequence. Ulcane sat in the pod and waited and thought about the marker. About the 3 sentences. About the 14 prior encounters and the 14 ships that had read those sentences and turned around. He thought about Thessane. He thought about the directorate meeting where his concerns had been noted and set aside in a room full of people who had been so confident in their own framework for understanding the universe that they had not been able to hear what was being said to them. He thought about 4,400 crew members and 1,212 of them who were not coming home. Then he opened a channel, not to the ships around him, to the consortium relay station at the edge of the nearest named system, the furthest reach of real-time communication, the link to everything he had left behind. "This is Fleet Singer Ulcane. Engagement outcome, catastrophic. The system was defended by a force of no fewer than 123 vessels demonstrating tactical capability entirely outside consortium doctrine or any known behavioral model. We engaged for 4 hours. We lost 29 ships. Survivor count as of this transmission, 2,116 out of 4,400 deployed. The opposition demonstrated foreknowledge of our arrival, preparation extending to an unknown period prior to the engagement, and willingness to absorb significant casualties to defend a boundary that had been identified and marked in advance." He paused. "The warning was real. The boundary is real. Whatever is beyond it is real, and it has been real for longer than we have existed." Another pause. Then, quietly, with the weight of a man who understands he is saying something that will be read for a long time, "Do not proceed. Do not send another fleet. Do not treat this as a setback to be overcome with greater force. Treat it as information. The most important information the consortium has ever received." He ended the transmission. The human vessel that recovered his pod matched his velocity with a precision that felt almost gentle. A retrieval arm extended. The pod was secured with a movement so controlled he barely felt it. Inside the vessel, it was quiet, operational, efficient. No visible signs of strain or crisis. Crew moved through corridors with the focused composure of people who had done what they came to do and were now doing what came after. He was held in a clean space with other survivors. No restraints. No guards in threat posture. Medical personnel moved between the injured with a practiced care that had no political content. They were treating people because those people were injured and needed treatment. That was all. After some time, the channel opened again. "You will be returned to consortium space when the remaining pods are recovered," she said. "You could have pursued us," he said. "Past the boundary. Into our own systems." "Yes." "You didn't." "No." "Why?" She looked at him. The answer was already in her eyes before she said it. "Because the boundary is the point. You crossed it. We responded. The response is complete. There is no further action required." He nodded slowly. He understood. Not everything, but enough. "You're not interested in conquest." No, just the line. Just the line. He was quiet for a moment. Then, how long have you been here? Waiting for this. She considered how to answer that. The marker was placed by those who came before us. We inherited the watch, as they inherited it from those before them. It has been a long time. Ulkane exhaled slowly. We never had a chance. You had the same chance every civilization has, she said. You had the warning. You chose not to take it. The channel closed. He sat with that for a long time. The survivors were returned across the boundary 2 days later, escorted to the edge of consortium space with the same precision and the same absence of theater that had characterized everything that had happened since the fleet crossed the line. The escort vessels stopped at the marker, turned back. The survivors continued alone. Ulkane watched the marker through the port as they passed it. The dark surface, the text that covered it, the 3 sentences that had been there before the star it orbited was born and would be there after that star had burned out and gone cold. You are entering restricted space. You were not invited. Turn around. He understood them now in a way he had not understood them before. They were not a warning about what would happen. They were a description of something that had already been true before the words were ever written. The space beyond that boundary was not territory in any sense the consortium's legal framework could engage with. It was something older than the frameworks, something that predated the categories. And whoever had built the marker had understood that any civilization capable of reading it would eventually, if it was paying any attention at all, understand that too. He had not been paying attention. He would be. The report did not remain classified. It was intended to. The Directorate sealed the engagement records under the highest available restriction protocols, limited access, controlled distribution, encrypted across every channel that could carry the data beyond consortium administration. For 11 days, the containment held. On the 12th, it didn't. These things never hold. Information wants out the way water wants down, finding every microscopic gap in every system that was built to stop it. A fragment appeared first. A tactical summary, stripped of identifiers, circulating through independent trade networks at the consortium's edge. An engagement between unequal forces and an outcome that did not match any projection. It was dismissed because people dismiss fragments. Then more followed. Sensor logs, casualty estimates, partial recordings of command transmissions, each piece incomplete on its own, together, assembling themselves into something that couldn't be looked away from. The numbers were what stopped every intelligence division in the compact cold when they finally had enough of them to run the models. 40 ships, against a prepared defensive force of 123. For hours of engagement. 29 consortium vessels lost. 11 crippled. 1,212 confirmed dead. Not in a campaign. In a single engagement. At a line that had been marked in advance and defended by a force that had known the attackers were coming before the attackers had finished planning to come. Every intelligence division fed the numbers into their models. Adjusted variables. Checked for error. The first engagement model, the one accounting for terrain advantage and prepared position and the numerical disparity, came back within ranges that were unusual but not impossible. A sufficiently prepared defensive force, leveraging the advantages of a system they knew and their opponents didn't, could achieve an outcome like this. Costly, remarkable, but within the envelope of known possibilities. Then they ran the behavioral analysis. The models failed quietly. They produced results that required manual review. The manual review confirmed the results. The behavioral patterns of the defending force did not match any known tactical doctrine, not any compact doctrine, not any extinct civilization's recovered military texts, not anything in the entire record of organized conflict that any intelligence service had ever assembled. The defending ships had operated with a level of individual adaptive response and collective situational awareness that the models flagged as beyond achievable through any known training and command methodology. The flag that came back from 3 separate agencies within 72 hours of each other was the same. Unknown actor. Extended temporal strategy. Non-standard conflict doctrine. Suggest immediate stand-down of all expansion activity in proximity to marked boundary zones. That was when the conversation in the compact changed. Not from curiosity to fear, not exactly. From analysis to recognition. From trying to understand what this was to beginning to understand what it meant. Thessain attended the sessions. He said very little. He had said what he needed to say, and he had been heard and not listened to, and the result was on the record. He sat in the sessions and watched the faces of people who were now, with considerable urgency and no small amount of discomfort, arriving at conclusions that had been available to them before any of this happened. The adjustment began quietly. Trade routes first. Minor deviations in standard navigation paths that placed additional distance between civilian traffic and the zones that were appearing, with sudden administrative urgency, on updated charts. Then diplomatic channels shifted. Requests for clarification. For contact. For any kind of formal communication with whatever was behind the boundary. The responses that came back were brief. The same brevity the marker had always shown. The boundary is not negotiable. Formal contact is not currently available. Do not cross. That was all. No threats. No demands. No attempt to leverage the engagement into territorial concessions or political influence. Just the line. Just the information that the line was real and would be treated as real regardless of what the compact decided to do with the information. An older empire that had maintained a century-long policy of aggressive territorial expansion issued an internal directive that year. Its language was dry, administrative, but it said something that had never been said in its history. If a boundary is marked, it is not unclaimed. The phrase spread the way true things spread, without needing to be pushed. Through conversation. Through the quiet exchange of understanding between people who had looked at the same data and arrived at the same place, and did not need anyone to tell them what to do with it. Boundary markers began appearing on official charts across the compact, not labeled as territory, not assigned to any recognized authority in any registry anyone could point to. Just marked. Just noted. A line. The word restricted, and nothing more. That was enough. Thessain retired 2 years later. He left behind a final document in the archive, not a policy recommendation and not a legal brief. Just a record of what he had observed and what he believed it meant. We encountered a civilization that did not introduce itself, he wrote. That did not negotiate or threaten or make demands. That simply built a line and waited for us to find it. And when we found it and read it and still crossed it, they responded with exactly the force required to end the crossing and not 1 unit more. They did not pursue us into our own space. They did not leverage the outcome for any advantage. They defended the line, and then they stopped. He paused in the writing, then continued. I think we will not cross the line again. Not because we have been frightened into compliance, though that is part of it, but because we have been shown something. Something that was already there to be seen. A boundary that does not need to justify itself because it was there before we existed and will be there after we are gone. Something built by people who understood that the most honest thing you can say to someone approaching your boundary is not "this is mine" or "you will regret this," but only, "you were not invited." Turn around. He closed the document. He did not read it again. Years passed. Not many. Enough. Enough for the event to move from immediate crisis into established knowledge. Enough for new crews to be trained on it, for new diplomats to study it, for the generation of officers who had not been there to learn about it the way you learn about things that happened before you and shaped everything about the conditions you were born into. A survey vessel approached one of the boundary markers, not by accident. A controlled mission, authorized, observed, intended to verify that the boundary remained consistent with the reports. The captain was young by survey standards. He had studied the engagement. He had read Ulcane's transmission. He had seen the models and the behavioral analyses and the intelligence assessments. He had spent enough time with the data to believe he understood what the marker was. He didn't. Not until he saw it. The ship slowed as it reached the outer edge of the marked zone. The beacon was visible on the forward display. A small, dark object against the starfield. Unchanged. The signal reached them immediately. Low power. Steady. 47 seconds between each pulse. The translation appeared on the display. 3 lines. You are entering restricted space. You are not invited. Turn around. The captain sat in the command chair and looked at those 3 sentences for a long time. He had expected to feel the weight of them in an abstract way, the way you feel the weight of historical events when you visit the sites where they happened. A respectful acknowledgement of something past. What he felt instead was present. Immediate. The sentences did not feel like history. They felt like they had been written this morning, for him, by something that had known exactly when he would arrive and had been patient enough to wait. Navigation, he said. His voice was quiet. Yes, Captain. Mark the boundary. Mark. Adjust course. The helmsman did not hesitate. The ship turned. The beacon remained in view for a few seconds longer, its signal steady, its presence unchanged by the decision made in front of it. Then it fell behind them. The system ahead, uncharted and resource-rich and full of everything the consortium was always hungry for, was left where it was. The captain watched the boundary recede. Then, very quietly, not quite to himself, not quite to his crew, but to the space between them, which was the only space in which some things can honestly be said, he said. They meant it. No one responded. They did not need to. Behind them, the beacon continued its pulse. 47 seconds. 47 seconds. 47 seconds. It had been pulsing at that interval before any civilization in this part of the galaxy had learned to build ships. It would be pulsing when those same civilizations were names in someone else's archaeological record. It did not know urgency. It did not know impatience. It did not know hope or fear or pride or the particular kind of grief that comes from sending people into places they were told not to go and watching what happens when they arrive. It only knew the line. And the line was where it had always been. Clear. Unchanged. Waiting for the next civilization that would eventually arrive at the same point and face the same choice, with the same warning in front of them and the same question behind it. Were they paying attention this time? Were they wise enough to understand? It didn't need to wonder. It just needed to remain. And it would.